The equation on whiteboard 7 was wrong. Mara Ose saw it the moment she pushed her cleaning cart through the double doors of computational lab 4, the way a carpenter sees a crooked nail from across a room. The bottom half of the board was covered in Velanith mathematical notation, looping silver script that flowed like cursive, each symbol carrying density values and spatial coordinates in the same glyph, and most of it was elegant, even beautiful. But the transition step between the third and fourth lines had a sign error. Someone had carried a negative coefficient through a matrix rotation and dropped it. The whole derivation after that point was structurally sound, but pointed in exactly the wrong direction, like a bridge built with perfect engineering off the wrong side of a river. She parked the cart by the door, pulled out her mop, and started on the floor. The Velanith computational wing of Araith Station's research directorate had 12 labs, and she cleaned all of them between the hours of 2200 and 600 station time, 5 nights a cycle. The floors were a pale composite material that the Velanith called Sureth, harder than marble, smoother than glass, and utterly unforgiving of any mark left by a shoe, a spilled drink, or the dense violet nutrient paste the researchers ate at their desks when they forgot to go to the commissary. Mara had been mopping Sureth floors for 14 months, and she was good at it. She was good at most things she put her hands to. That had always been more burden than gift. The sign error stared at her from across the room. She mopped the north quadrant of the lab, working in the steady overlapping pattern she had developed during her first week. Start at the far wall, work toward the door, let the cleaning solution sit for 30 seconds before the second pass, so it could break down the nutrient paste residue without leaving a film. The Velanith researchers were fastidious about their labs in every way except the floors. They cared about the whiteboards, the projection arrays, the environmental calibration of the air systems that kept the computational crystals at optimal resonance temperature. The floors were beneath their notice. So was Mara. She finished the north quadrant and moved to the south. The sign error was directly above her now, close enough that she could see the individual strokes of the researcher's notation: confident, fluid, the handwriting of someone who thought in mathematics the way most people thought in language. Whoever had written this was brilliant. They had simply made the kind of small, invisible mistake that brilliant people make when they have been staring at a problem for too long. Mara had a degree in applied mathematics from the University of Accra. She had a master's in computational fluid dynamics from Imperial College London. She had spent 6 years working at the European Space Agency's propulsion laboratory in Noordwijk, running simulations for ion drive exhaust plume modeling, before the funding cuts and the slow, grinding realization that the people who decided which research got supported did not look at her and see a mathematician. They saw a line item, a name in a report, a person who could be moved or removed without changing the shape of the work. She had left Earth 18 months ago because the Velanith Reach was hiring human workers for service positions on their research stations, and because the listing had mentioned atmospheric processing and computational facilities, and because she was 28 years old and already tired of being invisible in rooms where she was the smartest person present. On Araith Station, at least, the invisibility was honest. The Velanith did not see her because she was a cleaner, and cleaners were beneath the caste threshold that registered as persons in their social architecture. It was not personal. It was not about her skin or her accent or her gender. It was simply that she pushed a cart and carried a mop, and in the Velanith framework, that made her part of the infrastructure. Something that functioned but did not think. She finished the south quadrant and stood for a moment, wringing out the mop head into the bucket. The dirty water swirled pale violet from the nutrient paste residue. The sign error was right there. Third line, fourth symbol cluster. A negative that should have stayed negative through the rotation, but had been transcribed as positive on the next line. Mara looked at the door, looked at the whiteboard, looked at the door again. She picked up the eraser, a soft felt pad the Velenith used on their crystal surface boards, and corrected the sign. Then she followed the correction through the next 3 lines, adjusting each derivative term that the error had thrown off. She wrote in the same Velenith notation, which she had taught herself during her first month on the station, by studying the boards she cleaned every night. Her handwriting was smaller and more angular than the original researchers, but the mathematics was clean. She put the eraser down, picked up her mop, and moved to Lab 5. She told herself it was a one-time thing. She told herself she had gotten it out of her system. 2 nights later, she came back to Lab 4 and found the whiteboard rewritten. The researcher had clearly returned, seen the corrections, and instead of erasing them, had extended the derivation another 8 lines using Mara's fixed transition as the foundation. The new work was faster, more confident, heading towards something. A resonance frequency model for atmospheric particulate dispersion. Practical, important, and now pointed in the right direction. But line 6 of the new work had an integration boundary error. She stared at it. She told herself it was not her problem. She told herself that whoever this researcher was, they had decades of formal Velenith training and would catch their own mistake in the morning. She told herself that she had already crossed a line once, and that once was enough. She mopped the floor, cleaned the desks, emptied the recycling receptacles, and wiped down the environmental control panels on the east wall. She ran the duster over the projection arrays, careful not to disturb the alignment pins, the way her training manual specified. Then she picked up the eraser and fixed the integration boundary. It became a pattern. Every 3 or 4 nights when Mara cleaned Lab 4, there would be new work on Whiteboard 7. The researcher was building something substantial, a comprehensive atmospheric modeling framework that accounted for particulate interactions at the molecular level, something Mara recognized as being at least a generation beyond the models she had worked with at ESA. The mathematics was extraordinary, and every few iterations there would be a mistake, always small. Always the kind of error that came from working too fast, or too late, or too alone, a transposed index, a dropped constant, a boundary condition applied to the wrong domain. Mara fixed every one of them. She started carrying a small stylus in her coverall pocket, the kind the Velenith researchers left lying around by the dozen on desktops and chair armrests. It was easier to write with than the felt erasers, and it let her work in finer detail when the corrections required restructuring a chain of dependent terms. Some nights the fixes took 30 seconds. Some nights they took 20 minutes, and she had to rush through Labs 8 through 12 to finish her shift on time. She told herself she would stop. She told herself every night, the way a person tells herself she will quit tomorrow. But the problems were there, on the board, wrong, and she could not walk past a wrong equation any more than she could walk past a dripping faucet or a child with an untied shoelace. Something in her brain was wired to fix things. The fixing was not optional. It was the way she breathed. By the 4th week, a secondary maintenance technician named Joreth, a Velenith male from the logistics cast who supervised night shift cleaning crews, stopped Mara in the corridor outside Lab 6. "Your completion times have been irregular," Joreth said, consulting a data tablet. "Labs 8 through 12 have been averaging 7 minutes faster than standard, but Labs 4 through 7 have been running 12 to 15 minutes over. The South Wing labs accumulate more nutrient-paste residue," Mara said. "The researchers eat at their desks. The paste residue is the same density across all 12 labs. I checked. I do a more thorough second pass in the South Wing. The Sureth composite in those older labs shows streaking if the solution is not given adequate dwell time." Joreth studied her. His pale blue-gray eyes held the flat, evaluative gaze of a man whose job was to ensure that schedules were met and deviations were documented. He did not look hostile, merely precise. "Keep your total cycle within the standard window. If the South Wing labs require additional dwell time, Adjust your northern pass accordingly." "Yes, sir." He moved on. Mara adjusted her cleaning schedule, shaving 3 minutes off each of the North Wing labs by eliminating the second pass on the projection array housings, which did not actually need it. That gave her the 12 extra minutes she needed in the South Wing without triggering another review. It was the kind of optimization that came naturally to someone who had spent 6 years running computational simulations under tight deadline pressure. She did not think of it as remarkable. She thought of it as scheduling. One night in the 4th week, the correction was not small. The researcher had attempted a coordinate transformation, converting from a Velenith spherical harmonic basis to a cylindrical representation that would be more tractable for a specific atmospheric layer calculation, and had made the transformation correctly for the radial terms, but had botched the azimuthal component. The error propagated through 7 lines. Fixing it required Mara to rederive the entire transformation from scratch, which she did on the empty half of whiteboard 8, working in Velenith notation and checking each step twice. It took her 35 minutes, and she was so absorbed in the work that she forgot to mop the east quadrant of Lab 4 entirely. She noticed the unmapped section at the end, went back and mopped it. The idea that she would leave a floor half done was as unacceptable as leaving a derivation half corrected. Both were the same discipline. You paid attention, you did it right, you did not cut corners because nobody would know. In Lab 7, during her 3rd week of corrections, she found a second whiteboard with errors. Different handwriting, a junior researcher, less confident, working on thermal gradient modeling for habitat module ventilation systems. The errors were more frequent and less interesting than the ones in Lab 4 basic algebraic slips that any competent graduate student should have caught, but they were errors, and Mara could not leave them. She fixed those too. She also reorganized the researcher's variable definitions, which were scattered across the board in a way that made the logical flow nearly impossible to follow, grouping them by domain, and adding index markers that connected each variable to its first use. In Lab 9, she found a dataset transcription error on a wall display that nobody seemed to have noticed for weeks. A decimal point misplaced in a calibration constant for the atmospheric pressure monitoring system. She traced the implications of the error through 3 related displays on the same wall, and realized it had been throwing off the lab's readings for at least 2 months, corrupting every experiment that relied on ambient pressure data as a baseline. She corrected the source constant and left a notation mark a small dot in the margin that meant verified in Velenith administrative shorthand, which she had picked up from the logistics clipboards she cleaned in the administrative wing. Nobody noticed that correction either. In Lab 10, she found a whiteboard where a researcher had been attempting to model fluid dynamics in a rotating reference frame, and had used the wrong form of the Coriolis acceleration term. The error was subtle. The researcher had used a formulation that was valid in Cartesian coordinates, but had failed to transform it properly when switching to the cylindrical coordinate system that the rest of the derivation required. Mara fixed the transformation and added 3 lines extending the derivation past the point where the researcher had gotten stuck. Those 3 lines were, she realized afterward, the most satisfying mathematics she had done since leaving ESA. Her hands did not shake when she wrote them. They felt steady for the first time in months. The next morning, from the supply closet where she stored her cart, she heard 2 Velenith researchers walking past in the corridor. One of them was talking about whiteboard 8 in Lab 4. Someone extended the harmonic transformation. I thought Soren then must have come back last night, but her access log shows she left at 18:30. Maybe one of the juniors. The notation is too tight, too precise. Juniors write larger, they are still learning the compression. This is someone who knows the script well enough to write small. They passed without seeing Mara in the supply closet. She sat on her stool with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of water, and her heart hammering in a way that reminded her of the first time she had stood up at an ESA project review and presented her own work. That same mixture of fear and satisfaction, and the absolute inability to regret what she had done. By the 6th week, the work on Whiteboard 7 in Lab 4 was accelerating. The researcher was building momentum, each session's output longer and more ambitious. Mara saw the architecture of it now, a unified atmospheric resonance model that would allow a station's environmental systems to predict and compensate for particulate fluctuations before they happened rather than reacting after the fact. If it worked, it would mean cleaner air in every habitat module, fewer respiratory complications for species with sensitive membranes, better crop yields in agricultural bays. Real, practical, life-improving work. And it was accelerating because someone was fixing the errors overnight. The researcher never lost time backtracking, never spent hours hunting for the mistake that had sent a derivation sideways. They built on solid foundations every morning, and they did not know why. In the 7th week, the first note appeared. It was written in small, careful script at the bottom corner of Whiteboard 7, in formal Velanith. Who is correcting MY work? Myra read it while she mopped. She did not answer. She fixed the off by 1 index error on line 9, cleaned the floor, and moved on. The next night, a new note. I have reviewed the corrections. They are not merely accurate. They reflect a deep understanding of the underlying model. Whoever you are, please identify yourself. Myra mopped, fixed a misapplied Fourier decomposition on line 12, moved on. The notes grew longer, more insistent, then softer, almost pleading. The researcher began addressing the unknown corrector directly, as though writing letters to a ghost. I have asked every member of MY team. None of them made these corrections. The notation style does not match any researcher in the directorate. I have checked the lab access logs, only maintenance and cleaning staff enter between 2200 and 600. Mara's stomach tightened when she read that one. The words cleaning staff sat at the edge of the researcher's awareness like a fact that had not yet cohered into a hypothesis. She almost stopped. Almost. But the whiteboard had 3 errors that night the most in a single session, and 2 of them were structural, the kind that would cost the researcher a full day to untangle. She fixed all 3. She did not write a note. 2 nights later, a new message. The correction on line 14 tonight required knowledge of fluid coupling dynamics that is not covered in VELANITH computational curriculum. The approach is unfamiliar to me. It may be from an external mathematical tradition. If you are willing, I would like to discuss it. I am here most mornings from 700. Mara read the note and felt something shift in her chest, a door being pushed from the other side. The researcher had noticed not just the corrections but their character. They had recognized that the mathematics came from outside the Velanith tradition. That was a smaller step than the one from cleaning staff to mathematician, but it was a step in the right direction, and it frightened Mara more than anything had frightened her since leaving Earth. She mopped Lab 4. She did not correct anything that night. The whiteboard had no errors. She told herself it was because the work was clean. The next night there were 2 errors, small ones. She fixed them both and hated herself for how good it felt. 2 more notes appeared over the following days. The researcher had installed a vibration sensor on the whiteboard frame. It recorded writing pressure and timing. The corrections were made between 2300 and 100 during the night cleaning cycle. The writing pressure was lighter than any Velanith hand. The stylus was a standard directorate model, but the grip pattern was consistent with a species that had shorter fingers. And then, on the final night before everything changed, I believe the corrector is human. I believe they are a member of the cleaning staff. I do not know how this is possible. The mathematics on this board is the frontier of VELANITH atmospheric theory. No human in our personnel records has training in computational science at any level, but the evidence is clear. If you are reading this, please know that I am not angry. I am grateful, and I would very much like to understand. Mara read that note while standing in the middle of a freshly mopped floor, the surf gleaming around her feet. She read it 3 times. The word grateful sat in her chest like a warm stone. Nobody had been grateful for her work in years. Not the cleaning work. Jorath's evaluations were satisfactory, which meant she existed in the records as a functioning unit, and not the mathematical work, which until 6 weeks ago had existed only inside her own skull, unchecked, unvalidated, unseen. She fixed a transposed matrix index on line 8 and moved on. Then the researcher set a trap. Mara arrived at Lab 4 on a Tuesday night in the 8th week and found whiteboard 7 covered with a new derivation, 16 lines, dense, ambitious, extending the model into thermocoupling territory that Mara had been hoping the researcher would explore. She started mopping the north quadrant, reading the board as she worked, and by the time she reached the south quadrant she had found 2 errors. One was a genuine mistake, a dropped coefficient in a chain integral that probably came from fatigue. The other was wrong in a way that felt deliberate. A boundary condition set to 0 when it should have been set to the resonance frequency of the surrounding medium. The kind of error that a competent researcher would never make accidentally, but that would be invisible to anyone who did not deeply understand the physical system the mathematics described. It was a test, a wrong answer placed like a tripwire, designed to reveal whether the corrector was a pattern-matching savant who spotted notation inconsistencies or a genuine mathematician who understood the physics underneath. Mara stood in front of the board for a long time. The smart thing was to walk away, fix the genuine error, leave the test alone. Let the researcher conclude that the night corrector had limitations. Stay invisible, stay safe, stay a cleaner. She picked up her stylus and fixed both errors. Under the deliberate one, she wrote a single line in Velanith notation. This one was not a mistake, it was a test. The boundary condition should be the first-order resonance frequency of the medium, not 0. You know this. She put the stylus in her pocket, finished mopping, and moved on to Lab 5. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, with the particular tremor that came from doing something that could not be undone. The next night, she arrived at Lab 4 at 23:40 and found it occupied. A Velanith woman was sitting at the central workstation, her back to the door, her attention fixed on a holographic projection floating above the desk, the atmospheric model rendered in 3 dimensions, slowly rotating, its structure visible as a lattice of interconnected nodes and gradient fields. The woman's skin was the pale silver blue of the Velanith research cast, her hair a cascade of white silver pulled back with a simple clip, and she was wearing a lab coat that had been washed so many times it had gone soft at the elbows. She was not young. The fine lines around her eyes and the slight forward curve of her shoulders spoke of someone who had been bending over equations for longer than Mara had been alive. Mara stopped her cart in the doorway. The wheels did not squeak. She had fixed that rattle 3 months ago with a strip of packing foam. The woman did not turn around. Mara considered backing out, cleaning the other labs first, returning when the woman had left. The safe thing, the invisible thing, the thing a cleaner was supposed to do. Instead, she pushed the cart in and started mopping the north quadrant. The Velanith woman glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes, pale cyan, luminous in the lab's cool white lighting, registered the cleaning cart, the coveralls, the mop. She turned back to her projection without a word. Infrastructure acknowledged and dismissed, all in one motion. Mara mopped, the woman worked. The projection rotated slowly, and Mara could see it clearly from the floor, the full atmospheric model, every variable labeled, every connection mapped. It was the most beautiful piece of applied mathematics she had ever seen, and it had a deeper problem than any she had corrected on the whiteboard. The model's core assumption about particulate interaction coefficients was based on a linear approximation that broke down at high densities, the exact conditions that mattered most for the practical applications the researcher was targeting. The whole edifice was elegant, ambitious, and built on a foundation that would crack under real-world load. Mara knew a better approach. She had spent 2 years at ESA developing a nonlinear coefficient coupling method for exactly this class of problem. Ion drive exhaust plume modeling involved particulate interactions at densities that made atmospheric modeling look trivial. The method had never been published because the project was defunded before the paper was finished, but the mathematics was sound, and she had carried it in her head for 4 years the way a songwriter carries an unrecorded melody. She kept mopping. She finished Lab 4, moved through 5 and 6. At 1:30 she came back. The researcher was gone. Whiteboard 7 had 12 new lines, all built on the flawed linearization. Mara stood in front of the whiteboard with her stylus. She had been fixing sign errors and dropped constants for 8 weeks. Small corrections, invisible nudges. This was different. This was telling the researcher that their foundational approach was wrong and offering an alternative from a completely different mathematical tradition. She stood there for 11 minutes. The station's air circulators hummed. The Surrey floor gleamed where she had mopped it. Then she erased the bottom third of the whiteboard and wrote. She wrote the nonlinear coefficient coupling framework in full. Not in Vellenith notation, the method was too complex, too rooted in the conventions she had learned in Accra and London and Nordwijk. She wrote in human mathematical notation, the symbols small and precise, the derivation step by step with annotation notes in English where the logic required explanation. She showed the linearization failure point. She showed why it failed. She showed the alternative. She showed how it connected to the researcher's existing model with only 3 structural modifications. It took 45 minutes. She was late to labs 8 through 12 and had to skip the second mop pass on all of them, which left faint residue marks that she knew would bother her for the rest of the week. She put the stylus back in her pocket, picked up her mop, and went to finish her shift. The next night, Lab 4 was not just occupied, it was crowded. The silver-blue researcher was there, standing at the whiteboard, one hand resting against its surface the way a person rests a hand against a door they are not sure they should open. 3 others were present. 2 were younger, wearing the crisp lab coats of junior researchers, 1 male, 1 female, both with the luminous silver hair of the technical cast. The third was older, male, heavyset by Vellenith standards, wearing a formal administrative tunic with the research directorate's insignia on the collar. His skin was a deeper blue-violet, and his expression suggested someone who had been pulled from a comfortable evening and was not pleased about it. Behind him, standing near the projection array with her arms folded, was a 4th newcomer, a tall Vellenith woman in a dark formal robe with a silver collar chain that marked her as a member of the Araith Station Governing Council. Mara had cleaned her office twice. The woman had never acknowledged her existence. They were all looking at whiteboard 7, at the bottom third, covered in small, angular human notation. Mara stopped her cart in the doorway. This time the squeak would have been welcome, something to explain her presence, to frame her as the background infrastructure she was supposed to be. But the cart was silent. She had fixed it too well. The man in the administrative tunic turned first. His eyes swept over her cart, coveralls, mop, dust rag folded over the handle. He turned back to the whiteboard. "The cleaning crew," he said in Vellenith. "They have access during off hours, but this," he gestured at the human notation. "This is not cleaning." The silver-blue researcher, whose name, Mara would soon learn, was Elathi Sorendhan, senior theorist of the Directorate's Atmospheric Sciences Division, turned and looked at Mara. For the first time in 14 months, a Vellenith on Araith Station looked at Mara as though she might be a person. You, Elathi said, in accented but competent standard. You are the night cleaner for this lab. Mara's grip tightened on the mop handle. Yes, ma'am. You have been cleaning this lab for 14 months. 14 months and 6 days. Elathi turned back to the whiteboard. Her long, silver-tipped fingers traced the air near the human notation, following the derivation the way a musician follows a score. This is a nonlinear coefficient coupling framework for particulate interaction modeling. It addresses the precise failure mode in my linearization approach. It is written in human mathematical notation with English annotation. She turned back to Mara. Did you write this? The administrative official Verath Keithan, director of research operations, made a sound that in Velanith culture was the equivalent of a polite scoff. Elathi, she is a cleaner. I asked her, not you. Elathi's voice was quiet in the way that outranks volume. Did you write this? Yes, Mara said. Silence. The two junior researchers exchanged glances. The councilwoman Thessain Velath Soren unfolded her arms and took a half-step forward, her expression sharpening. Verath's face shifted from skepticism to the discomfort of a man whose framework for the world had just developed a crack. The corrections, Elathi said, for the past 8 weeks. The sign errors, the integration boundaries, the index transpositions, that was you. Yes. Every one of them. Yes, and the thermal gradient corrections in Lab 7, and the calibration constant in Lab 9, and the Coriolis term transformation in Lab 10. The second silence was longer than the first. Lab 7 was a different researcher's domain. Lab 9 was instrumentation. Lab 10 was fluid dynamics. Mara had just revealed that her corrections extended across the entire computational wing. Verath studied her. Where did you learn Velanith mathematical notation? From the whiteboards. I cleaned 12 labs. I have been reading the boards every night for 14 months. You taught yourself our notation system from observation while cleaning floors. The cleaning is what gives me access. The reading is what I do while the floor dries. Thessain spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of someone who managed institutions. You corrected 6 labs, for how long? Lab 4 for 8 weeks. The others between 3 and 5 weeks, depending on when I first noticed errors. And no researcher noticed. No one noticed because no one checked. The corrections were small, and the researchers assumed their own work was clean. Nobody looks at a whiteboard in the morning and thinks someone fixed this overnight. They see that it looks right and keep going. The junior researcher, the young woman with luminous silver hair, cleared her throat. Theorist Soren, then, with respect, this is a cleaning cast human. The notation on the board could be a transcription. Someone else's work, copied from a data tablet. We should not. Sarath, Elathi did not raise her voice. Look at the annotation notes. They are in English, written in the same hand as the mathematics. They contain contextual explanations of why each step follows from the last. A copyist reproduces symbols. This person is teaching. Sarath looked at the whiteboard again. She looked at Mara. The confusion on her face was not hostile. It was the genuine bewilderment of someone whose entire understanding of how the world organized itself had just been contradicted by a woman with a mop. Elathi pulled a chair away from the nearest workstation and sat down, folding her hands. She studied Mara with focused, patient attention, the look of someone examining a problem that interested her deeply. Tell me about the coefficient coupling framework, she said. I have 4 more labs to clean tonight. They will wait. My supervisor tracks completion times. If I fall behind. Your supervisor reports to Director Keithan. The director is standing right there. Council member Velath Soren is behind him. Your labs will wait. Elathi's voice was not unkind, but it carried the absolute certainty of someone who recognized she was no longer certain of her own ranking in this room. Please, tell me about the framework. Mara set the mop against the wall. She walked to the whiteboard. She picked up the stylus. And she talked. She walked them through the nonlinear coupling method from first principles, not the way she would have explained it to a colleague at ESA, but the way she would have taught it to a graduate seminar, building each concept on the last, translating between human and Velanith notation as she went. She showed where the standard Velanith linearization broke down and why. She showed the alternative. She showed how it connected to Elatha's atmospheric model with 3 structural modifications. Then she showed them 3 extensions Elatha had not considered applications to environmental systems that the original framework could support with minor adjustments. A 4th extension, specific to agricultural bay management, drew on techniques from her exhaust plume modeling work at ESA. It solved a class of particulate accumulation problems that the Velanith environmental engineering literature treated as intractable. She solved the intractable problem in 12 lines and then stood back, looking at it, and added a 13th line that generalized the solution to an entire family of related problems. Halfway through the presentation, Verath Keithan sat down. He had been standing with his arms folded for 40 minutes, his expression cycling through disbelief and procedural discomfort, and then Mara had written a 7-line proof that unified 2 branches of Elatha's model that the senior theorist had been treating as separate systems. Elatha made a sound, a small, involuntary exhalation, the Velanith equivalent of a gasp, and Verath sat down because his legs apparently needed to process what his brain was taking in. That unification, Elatha said, leaning forward in her chair. I spent 3 months trying to bridge those 2 subsystems. I assumed they required a separate coupling mechanism. They do not, Mara said, still writing. They are the same mechanism expressed in 2 different bases. Watch. She wrote 4 more lines, and the 2 subsystems folded together like 2 halves of a closing book. Sarath, the junior researcher who had suggested Mara was a copyist, was staring at the whiteboard with the expression of someone watching a magic trick performed in broad daylight. She had her data tablet in her hands and was quietly recording the derivation, her fingers moving across the surface with the urgency of a person who sensed she was watching something that would not happen again. Mara was not performing. She was doing the thing she had always done, solving problems because they were there, because leaving them unsolved felt like leaving a wound unbandaged. She had not stood at a whiteboard like this in years, and the act of writing mathematics in front of people who could follow it, who could see what she was doing and understand why it mattered, was like drinking water after a long drought. She had not realized how thirsty she had been. When she finished, the lab was quiet. Elatha was leaning forward, her cyan eyes wide. The junior researchers had stopped pretending composure. Verath's expression had migrated from skepticism through discomfort to something that looked, against his considerable will, like awe. Thessane was standing very still with the look of a woman re-evaluating a 14-month-old hiring decision. You have a degree, Elatha said, not a question. Masters in Computational Fluid Dynamics. Imperial College London. And before this station, Propulsion Research, European Space Agency, Ion Drive Exhaust Plume Modeling, 6 years. And you left that to mop floors on a Velanith research station. Mara picked up the mop. The gesture was automatic. Her hands felt wrong without a tool in them. I left it because no one would let me do the work I was trained to do. The funding was cut. The team was dissolved. I applied to 4 other positions and was told each time the role had been filled, even when I could see the listing still active months later. I came here because the listing mentioned computational facilities, and I thought that even if I could not use them, I could at least be near them. Near problems worth solving. You came to mop floors, near the kind of work you should have been doing. I came to work. The mopping was the job available. It is honest work. But you could not stop solving. No, the word came out quieter than Mara intended. I cannot walk past a broken thing without fixing it. I have tried. The equations are on the boards every night and some of them are wrong, and I can see exactly where they went wrong and exactly how to fix them. Leaving them is like hearing a note out of tune in a chord. You cannot unhear it. Your hands go to the instrument whether you want them to or not. Elathi studied her face. Something in her expression softened the recognition of one compulsive mind seeing another. How many hours of sleep do you get between your cleaning shift and the rest of your day? 4, sometimes 5. For 14 months. The human body adapts. The human mind does not stop working during those 4 hours. Mara did not answer because the answer was obvious. She dreamed in equations. She had dreamed in equations since she was 14 years old, and the dreams had never stopped. Thessing spoke. Director Keithan, what is the reclassification process for a service-level employee to a research position? Verath straightened. Formal competency assessment, board review, credential equivalency evaluation, 3 to 6 weeks minimum. Make it 2. The process exists because we assumed this situation was impossible. The assumption was wrong. 2 weeks, Director. Elathi stood and walked to the whiteboard. She was a full head taller than Mara, with the angular frame of the research cast. She studied the 12 lines of the agricultural-based solution. This is publishable, she said quietly. On its own, this single derivation solves a problem that 3 directorate teams have worked on for over a year. It is a straightforward application of nonlinear coupling to a bounded diffusion system, Mara said. The mathematics is not complicated. The standard approach was overcomplicating it by treating a deterministic process as stochastic at the scale that matters. Straightforward. Elathi looked at her with the expression of a colleague, an equal. It was the first time anyone had looked at Mara that way since her last good day at ESA 7 years ago. You have been undercutting my life's work with straightforward corrections, made with a borrowed stylus, during a cleaning shift. The stylus was on the floor under a desk. I assumed it was discarded. It was. That is not the point. Elathi's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that a smile was structurally possible. Verath paused near the door. He looked back at the whiteboard at Elathi's elegant Velanith script flowing across the top 2/3, and Mara's smaller, angular human notation filling the bottom third. 2 mathematical traditions meeting on the same surface. 6 labs, he said. You were correcting 6 labs. Yes. How much of the directorate's published output in the last 14 months rests on foundations you quietly adjusted during cleaning shifts? Mara thought about it. I do not know, I did not keep track. The corrections were small. Most of them would have been caught eventually. Eventually. Verath repeated the word as though weighing it on a scale. In research, eventually can mean the difference between a paper published this quarter and a paper published next year, between a grant renewed and a grant lost. He left without another word. Sarath, the junior researcher, lingered at the door. She looked at Mara, then at the whiteboard, then at Mara again. The variable reorganization in Lab 7, she said. The index markers connecting each variable to its first use. That was you too. Yes. I am the researcher in Lab 7. Mara waited. Your reorganization saved me 3 days of work, Sarath said. I thought the lab's computational assistant had done it automatically. I did not even think to question it. She paused. I am sorry I suggested you were a copyist. You had no reason to think otherwise. No, but I should have waited for evidence before making the assumption. Sarath left. Elathi settled back into her chair. Finish your shift. I will be here when you return. Mara cleaned labs 8 through 12 in 67 minutes, the fastest she had ever completed the route. She did not skip the second mop pass on any of them. She was a cleaner, and she cleaned properly, because the work mattered even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. When she returned to Lab 4, Elathi had cleared the central workstation, activated a fresh holographic display, and set 2 cups of pale green Velenith mineral tea on the desk. The tea was too bitter for human taste. Mara had tried it once and nearly spat it out, but Elathi had added something, a sweetener that smelled like honey and tasted like warm stone, and it was drinkable. It was the first time in 14 months that anyone on Araith Station had made her a cup of anything. They worked until 5:30. They worked in a way Mara had not worked since her best days at ESA, 2 minds pushing against the same problem from different angles, each one seeing things the other missed, each correction sparking a new avenue. Elathi's grasp of atmospheric dynamics was deeper and broader than Mara's, shaped by decades of theoretical tradition that approached natural systems with an elegance human mathematics rarely achieved. Mara's instinct for nonlinear systems was sharper, more aggressive, willing to chase solutions into territory that Velenith convention considered unseemly. Together, they were faster than either of them alone. At 200, they hit a wall. The nonlinear coupling framework worked for the particulate interaction layer, but the atmospheric model had a second layer, thermal convection in rotating habitats, that the coupling did not address. Elathi had been treating the 2 layers as independent systems with a simple feedback term connecting them. Mara stared at the holographic model for 3 minutes, rotating it with her fingers, looking at the junction between the 2 layers, and then said, "They are not independent. The coupling term is insufficient. The thermal convection modifies the particulate density field, which modifies the interaction coefficients, which feed back into the convection. It is a closed loop. You cannot linearize the feedback without losing the dynamics that matter." Elathi looked at the junction point in the model. Her cyan eyes tracked the feedback pathway Mara had identified. If I cannot linearize the feedback, the system becomes analytically intractable. No closed-form solution. Not with Velenith methods, but there is a class of solutions in human nonlinear dynamics called limit cycle attractors. The system does not need a closed-form solution. It needs a stability basin, a region of parameter space where the coupled system settles into a predictable oscillation. You do not solve it. You characterize where it goes. Elathi stared at her. You are proposing that we abandon the search for an exact solution, and instead map the solution space topologically. Yes. That is not how we do atmospheric science. I know, but it is how the atmosphere actually works. There was a silence that lasted almost a full minute. Elathi looked at the holographic model. She looked at Mara. She looked at the model again. Then she laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first time Mara had heard a Velenith laugh. It sounded like a bell struck once and dampened. "Show me," Elathi said. Mara showed her. It took an hour. When they were done, the model had a second coupling layer that treated the thermal convection feedback as a dynamical system with a characterized stability basin rather than a linearized approximation. It was mathematically unconventional by Velenith standards. It was also correct. At 4:30, Elathi sat back and stared at the rotating holographic model. The nonlinear coupling was integrated. The stability basin was mapped. The model was whole for the first time since she had begun building it 18 months ago. "I kept hitting the same wall," Elathi said quietly, "and I kept assuming the wall was in the mathematics. It was not in the mathematics. It was in my assumptions about what kind of mathematics was permissible. The linearization protocol is standard in Velenith computational theory. You were trained to use it. And you were not. You came at the problem from outside the training, the conventions, the cast assumptions about who does theoretical work and how." Elathi paused. "You saw the wall because you had never been taught that it was load-bearing. I just saw a mistake and fixed it. Yes, that is what makes it extraordinary." The review board convened 11 days later. Vareth Keithan presented the case with the thorough precision of a man who had decided to win a fight he had not chosen. He had compiled a dossier of every correction Mara had made across all 6 labs, 47 individual mathematical interventions over 8 weeks, each one verified by the lab's primary researcher. 3 of the corrections had been independently classified as non-trivial contributions to active research by the Directorate's peer review committee. 1. A stability analysis she had solved in the margin of a whiteboard in Lab 11 during the 9th week. 11 lines of notation, so small she had braced her writing hand against the board surface to keep the symbols legible, had been classified as novel work of publishable quality. Elathi submitted a 40-page technical recommendation that 3 board members needed translation assistance to parse. Thessin attended as an observer and said nothing, which in Velenith administrative culture was louder than anything she could have said. Mara sat in a hard chair in the anteroom, wearing her cleaning coveralls because she did not own anything else on the station, her mop across her knees because she had come straight from her shift. She noticed, with the part of her brain that could not stop noticing, that there was a scuff mark near the baseboard by the chamber door that someone had missed. She did not get up to clean it. She sat and waited. When the board called her in, she left the mop leaning against the wall outside the chamber door. She noticed that she positioned it carefully, angled so it would not slide, the mop head up so the fibers could air dry. Old habits, clean habits. They asked her to solve 3 problems. The first was a standard Velenith competency exercise, a resonance frequency calculation. She completed it in 4 minutes. The board had allotted 30. The second was a structural analysis of a failing environmental model, one of Elathi's earlier rejected frameworks, selected because the board assumed it was unsolvable. Mara identified the failure mode in 6 minutes and proposed a correction path in 8. One board member asked her to clarify a step. She did, in fluent Velenith notation, without hesitation. The third was not a test. It was a real problem, a particulate accumulation anomaly in Araith Station's own agricultural bay that the environmental engineering team had been struggling with for 3 months. The board included it as a theoretical exercise. Mara solved it completely in 22 minutes, filling 2 whiteboards. She did not merely solve the particulate problem. She identified a secondary thermal cycling inefficiency costing the agricultural bay 11% of its crop yield, and corrected that too in a 6-line addendum that she almost did not include because it seemed obvious. The station's chief environmental engineer, sitting in the back row as a technical observer, would later describe her 22-minute performance as either a breakthrough or a hallucination, and I have confirmed it is not a hallucination. The board approved the reclassification 4-1. The dissenting member cited procedural concerns. He changed his vote the following morning after reviewing Mara's solution and realizing it also fixed a 6-month-old problem in his own research. Mara was offered a position as associate researcher in the Atmospheric Sciences Division, with full lab access, computational resources, and a salary 4 times her cleaning wage. She accepted. She asked for one condition. "I want to keep my cleaning shift," she said. Vareth blinked. "You want to continue mopping floors?" 2 nights a week, labs 4 through 7. I will do the research during day shifts, but I want to keep the cleaning. Why? Mara thought about it. She thought about the quiet of the night shift, the rhythm of the mop, the way the Surith floors gleamed when they were properly done. She thought about the whiteboard she had read every night for 14 months, absorbing an entire field of Velenith mathematics through the simple inability to walk past a problem without engaging with it. She thought about how the best ideas she had ever had came while her hands were busy with something simple, and her mind was free to wander. "Because the mopping is how I think," she said, and because someone should do it properly. Those floors are cleaned by me, or they are not cleaned at all. The substitute crews do one pass and leave residue in the corners. I have seen their work. Verath opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Elathi. Elathi was watching Mara with an expression that Mara had seen only once before on the face of her graduate advisor at Imperial College. The afternoon he had read her thesis draft and sat in silence for a full minute before saying, "This changes things." It was the expression of someone who understood that they were looking at a person who would always be exactly what they were, regardless of title or circumstance. A person who mopped floors with the same care they brought to mathematics, because the care was not a strategy. It was the whole person. "She is not keeping the cleaning shift because she is sentimental," Elathi said to Verath. "She is keeping it because that is when she reads the whiteboards. That is when she catches errors. That is when she thinks. If you take away the mop, you take away the conditions under which she does her best theoretical work." She paused. "I have spent 31 years trying to create the conditions for my own best work. This woman found hers with a mop and a borrowed stylus. I am not going to interfere with that." Thessing, who had remained for the final session, looked at Mara and said nothing. But the faintest trace of something that might have been approval crossed her face, the look of a woman who recognized the kind of person who could not leave any job half done, because that was the kind of person Thessing was too. "2 nights a week," Verath said. "Labs 4 through 7. Thank you. You will be the most overqualified cleaner in the history of the directorate." "Probably," Mara said. "But the floors will be clean." She started her research position the following Monday. Elathi had cleared a workstation for her in Lab 4, the same lab she had been cleaning for 14 months, the same whiteboard where she had made her first correction. The Surith floor under her new desk had a faint scuff mark from her cleaning cart's left rear wheel, a mark she recognized because she had been meaning to buff it out for 3 weeks. She kept her cleaning shifts on Tuesdays and Fridays. On those nights, she would change out of the crisp directorate lab coat that Elathi had requisitioned for her and back into her coveralls, retrieve her cart from the supply closet, and clean labs 4 through 7 the way she had always cleaned them, methodically, thoroughly, with the overlapping mop pattern and the 30-second dwell time for the cleaning solution. Other researchers would see her mopping the floors of labs she worked in during the day, and some of them did not know what to make of it. A junior researcher in Lab 6 once asked her why she did not simply hire someone else to clean her wing. "Because I do it well," Mara said, "and because this is when I think." It was true. Her best ideas still came during the cleaning shifts. The rhythm of the mop, the repetitive motion, the quiet of the station at night, all of it freed something in the back of her brain that desk work kept caged. She solved a 3-week impasse in the thermocoupling section of the Model 1 Tuesday night while mopping the corridor outside Lab 5. She stopped, wrote 6 lines on the nearest whiteboard, went back and finished mopping. In the morning, she transferred the 6 lines to the holographic model, and Elathi stared at them for a full minute before saying, "You thought of this while cleaning." "I thought of it while the floor dried." Within 3 months, the atmospheric resonance model was complete, a unified framework for environmental prediction that would be implemented across 11 Velenith stations within a year, reducing respiratory complications by 31% and improving agricultural yields by 18% across the reach. The paper was published under 2 names, Sarendhan and Osai. Elathi insisted on alphabetical order, which put Mara second. Mara did not care about the ordering. She cared that the mathematics was correct, that the methodology was reproducible, and that the practical applications section did not overstate the model's predictive range. She checked the proofs 3 times before submission. She also checked the formatting, the reference numbering, and the figure labels, because she was the kind of person who checked everything. On the night the paper was accepted for publication, Mara cleaned Lab 4 as usual Tuesday shift, the Surith showing scuff marks from an afternoon departmental meeting that had run long. She mopped in her usual pattern, north quadrant first, steady overlapping passes, the solution sitting for 30 seconds before the second pass. The whiteboard above her desk now, the one Elathi had assigned her on the first day, had the opening framework of their next project, a thermal exchange model for deep space habitat modules. There was already an error on line 4, a transposed coefficient. Small, invisible, the kind of mistake that comes from thinking too fast. Mara set down the mop, picked up her stylus and fixed it. The floor could wait, it always could, but the equation could not, it never could. She picked up the mop again and finished the floor, because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who could not leave any job half done, the kind who cared about all of it, whether anyone was watching or not. The Surith gleamed under the lab's cool white lights. The whiteboard was correct. And Mara Osai, associate researcher and Tuesday-Friday night cleaner, went home to sleep the dreamless sleep of a woman who had left nothing in the world uncorrected that she had the power to fix.